That burger on your plate might not be what you think it is. It didn't come from a cow. It didn't come from a farm. It was grown in a lab. Right now in the United States, restaurants are quietly serving chicken made from cells in stainless steel tanks. Your chicken nugget just became a science experiment. The USDA has already approved it, and yet almost nobody knows it's happening. The question is, what's really inside this so-called future of food? Don't eat it until you watch this. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is lab-grown meat? The industry prefers a cleaner name. They call it cultivated meat. It sounds futuristic, almost friendly, but here's the truth. It's not vegan and it's not plant-based. It's real animal meat, just grown in a very unnatural way. Instead of raising a cow or a chicken, scientists take a handful of animal cells. They feed those cells a special mix of nutrients, and they place them inside giant steel tanks, the kind you'd expect to see in a brewery, not a kitchen. The cells multiply, forming tissue, which is then harvested, shaped, and sold as nuggets, burgers, or strips of chicken. On the surface, the sales pitch is tempting. No slaughterhouses, no animal cruelty, and supposedly less damage to the planet. Companies like Upside Foods and Good Meat claim this is a revolution, the beginning of a world where meat can be clean, ethical, and sustainable. But here's the catch. If this is truly the future of food, why have so few people even heard of it? Why aren't governments shouting about this breakthrough from the rooftops? And more importantly, why are billion-dollar investors rushing it onto your plate before the public has had the chance to ask the tough questions? Keep watching, because once you see who's really behind this movement, the story takes a much darker turn. If you follow the money, the story gets even more interesting, because lab-grown meat isn't just a quirky science project. It's being backed by some of the richest and most powerful people on the planet. We're talking names like Bill Gates, Richard Branson, and even giant venture funds like SoftBank, global food corporations, the same ones that already dominate supermarket shelves, are quietly buying stakes in startups like Upside Foods, Good Meat, and Believer Meats. The reason? They don't want to miss out on what could be the next multi-billion-dollar industry. And here's the sales pitch. By 2030, they claim lab-grown meat could be everywhere, not just in a handful of restaurants, but in grocery stores, fast food chains, even in your child's school lunch. That's the future they're selling to investors. But here's the question nobody's answering. If this is such a miracle solution, why does it need so much billionaire money to keep it alive? These companies are burning through cash year after year with very little to show the public. Why the rush to scale something most people don't even want and haven't even heard of? And that leads us to the bigger problem. What does it actually take to create meat in a lab? And what are you really eating when you bite into it? The process itself might shock you more than the investors ever could. So how do you actually grow meat in a lab? Here's where things start to feel less like food and more like Frankenstein. It begins with a biopsy, a small sample of animal cells taken from a chicken or a cow. Those cells are placed into giant stainless steel tanks called bioreactors. Think of a beer brewery, but instead of brewing beer, they're multiplying flesh. The cells are then fed a carefully engineered growth medium. Early versions of this mix included something called fetal bovine serum, literally taken from unborn calves. Companies claim they've moved away from it, but the reality is murky, and many are still experimenting with animal-based serums and synthetic chemicals to keep the cells alive. And here's something the industry doesn't advertise. One study found that producing just a small batch of lab-grown meat required over 300 liters of growth medium. That's more liquid than it takes to raise a whole chicken, raising real doubts about how efficient this process really is. Over days and weeks, the cells expand, clumping together into tissue. But they don't naturally form a burger or a nugget. They have to be harvested, processed, and mixed with binders, stabilizers, and flavor additives, just to resemble what you'd recognize as meat. Companies love to show glossy photos of sizzling nuggets or juicy burgers, but behind the scenes, this isn't farm-to-table food. It's closer to a chemistry experiment. And here's the bigger question. If the process is this complicated, how safe is it really? The answer isn't what the billionaires want you to hear. Here's where the shine really starts to fade, because for all the glossy photos and big promises, lab-grown meat comes with questions nobody has answered yet. First, safety. The USDA and FDA gave approvals after reviewing short-term studies, but let's be honest, nobody on this planet knows the long-term effects of eating meat grown in a bioreactor. This isn't decades of testing, it's a few reports and a lot of trust in companies backed by billionaires. Then there's labeling. Right now, cultivated chicken sold in the US must be marked as such, but the food industry is famous for loopholes. What happens when lab-grown proteins are mixed into processed foods? Will you even know if you're eating it? Health is another concern. To keep those cells alive, companies add nutrients, chemicals, and sometimes antibiotics. Then, to make the product edible, they add stabilizers and flavor enhancers. Strip away the marketing, and what you're left with is highly processed food with unknown long-term impacts. And perhaps the biggest issue of all, trust. Surveys show most consumers don't even realize lab-grown meat is already being served in America. Imagine walking into a restaurant and ordering chicken, not knowing whether it came from a farm or from a lab. And not every country is on board. Italy has already banned lab-grown meat entirely, calling it a threat to food tradition and safety. Other governments are stalling approvals, worried that the long-term health and environmental claims simply don't add up. Which leaves us with a bigger question. If the risks are this unclear, who really benefits from pushing this onto our plates? So when you put all of this together, the hype, the billionaires, the secretive process, the unanswered risks, one question cuts through everything. Who really benefits from lab-grown meat? On paper, the answer is easy. Investors stand to win big. Companies like Upside Foods and Good Meat have positioned themselves to control patents, supply chains, and eventually your dinner plate. Imagine a future where meat isn't raised by farmers but manufactured by corporations in sterile factories. That's not food security, that's food monopoly. And what about farmers? The people who have produced meat for centuries. If this technology scales, traditional farms could be pushed aside, replaced by steel tanks in industrial parks. Instead of competing with neighbors, farmers could be competing with billion-dollar labs. The public, meanwhile, is being sold a dream. Meat without cruelty, without climate guilt, without compromise. But without full transparency, how do we know if that dream is real? If the production process is more energy-intensive than raising animals, is this really helping the planet? If chemicals and additives are needed to make it edible, is this really healthier? In the end, maybe the biggest question is the simplest. Do you trust your food more when it comes from a farmer or from a laboratory experiment? Lab-grown meat isn't a prediction. It's not a distant future. It's already here, already approved, and already being served on plates in America. The only reason most people haven't heard of it is because the companies behind it don't want you to ask questions. Not yet. They call it progress. They call it the future. They'll tell you it's cleaner, safer, better for the planet. But when something is rushed through approvals, pushed by billionaires, and hidden behind glossy marketing campaigns, you have to stop and ask, what's the real story? Because this isn't just about what's on your plate tonight. It's about who controls food tomorrow. When meat comes from a farmer, you know its story. When meat comes from a laboratory, that story belongs to corporations, investors, and patents. And here's the part that should make you pause. If this technology can replace a chicken nugget, what else can it replace? Beef? Pork? Fish? One day, maybe even dairy, eggs, or milk. It's not just meat that's being rewritten, it's the entire food chain. So before you take a bite of this so-called future of food, remember this. Once the switch flips, there's no going back. If you want to see more hidden food exposés like this, make sure you subscribe, because next week, we're exposing another shocking truth the industry doesn't want you to know.